The winter of 1613 marked a pivotal moment in Russian history when the Zemsky Sobor, the Assembly of the Land, convened in Moscow to address the most pressing question facing the fractured realm: who would rule Russia? The time of troubles had devastated the country for over a decade, leaving behind a trail of foreign occupation, pretender czars, and social upheaval that threatened to tear the very fabric of the Russian state apart. Swedish forces controlled Novgorod, Polish troops occupied the Kremlin, and Cossack bands roamed the countryside, while various boyar families schemed for power amidst the chaos. The assembly hall buzzed with tension as representatives from across the realm deliberated. Merchants from Arkhangelsk sat alongside Orthodox clergy, while Cossack atamans debated with provincial nobles. The stakes could not have been higher. The wrong choice might plunge Russia into another cycle of civil war and foreign intervention. After weeks of intense discussion, the assembly reached a consensus that would shape Russian history for the next 3 centuries. They elected 16-year-old Michael Romanov as Tsar of all Russias. Michael Fedorovich Romanov possessed several crucial advantages that made him an acceptable candidate to the fractured political landscape. His family had maintained strong ties to the previous Rurik dynasty through marriage. His great-aunt Anastasia had been the beloved first wife of Ivan the Terrible. This connection provided legitimacy, while avoiding the bitter factional disputes that plagued other noble houses. Equally important, the Romanovs had suffered under Boris Godunov's persecution, with Michael's father, Filaret, having been forcibly tonsured as a monk and exiled. This persecution ironically enhanced their credibility, as they could not be accused of complicity in the disasters that had befallen Russia. The young Tsar's coronation on July 11, 1613, in the Cathedral of the Assumption within the Moscow Kremlin, marked the beginning of a new era. However, the ceremony itself reflected the precarious state of the realm. The traditional regalia bore scars from the recent troubles, the crown of Monomach had been damaged during the Polish occupation, and several pieces of the imperial treasury had been looted or sold to finance various military campaigns. The assembled boyars who witnessed the coronation represented a nobility that had been decimated by years of warfare and political purges. Michael's early reign unfolded under the shadow of his father's absence. Filaret Romanov remained in Polish captivity, having been seized during the failed embassy to negotiate with false Dmitry II. This circumstance thrust the teenage Tsar into a position where he relied heavily on his mother, the formidable Martha Romanova, and a council of boyars who had supported his election. The arrangement created an unusual dynamic where traditional autocratic power was temporarily diluted by necessity rather than design. The new administration faced immediate challenges that tested their resolve and competence. Russian finances lay in ruins, with the treasury virtually empty and traditional revenue sources disrupted by years of warfare. The military, such as it was, consisted of unreliable foreign mercenaries, undisciplined militia units, and Cossack bands whose loyalty shifted with their immediate interests. Large swaths of territory remained under foreign control, while bandits and remnants of various pretender armies continued to operate across the countryside. The government's first priority involved securing the borders and expelling foreign forces. The war with Sweden dragged on until 1617, when the Treaty of Stolbovo finally brought peace. Russia regained Novgorod and other territories but lost access to the Baltic Sea, a strategic setback that would influence Russian foreign policy for generations. The agreement with Poland proved more complex, requiring the Treaty of Dolino in 1618, which established a 14-year truce but left Smolensk and other western territories in Polish hands. Filaret's return from captivity in 1619 transformed the political landscape of early Romanov rule. The reunion between father and son was marked by an unprecedented arrangement. Filaret was elevated to the position of Patriarch of Moscow and all Russia, while simultaneously being recognized as great sovereign alongside his son. This dual sovereignty created a unique power structure where ecclesiastical and secular authority merged within a single family, effectively concentrating power while maintaining the appearance of traditional Orthodox hierarchy. The Filaret-Michael partnership proved remarkably effective in addressing Russia's accumulated problems. Filaret brought extensive administrative experience and political acumen gained during his years of exile and captivity. His understanding of European diplomatic practices and military innovations proved invaluable as Russia sought to modernize its institutions. while maintaining its traditional character. The Patriarch Tsar exercised considerable influence over domestic policy, foreign relations, and military organisation, often overshadowing his son in practical governance. Administrative reforms during this period focused on rebuilding the machinery of government that had collapsed during the time of troubles. The prikaz system, Russia's traditional administrative departments, was reorganised and expanded to handle the complex tasks of governing a recovering state. New departments were created to manage foreign affairs, military recruitment, and territorial administration, while existing offices were reformed to eliminate corruption and improve efficiency. The consolidation of autocratic power proceeded gradually but systematically. The early Romanovs understood that their legitimacy depended on demonstrating effective governance rather than simply asserting divine right. They worked to reduce the influence of the Boyar Council not through dramatic confrontation, but through the steady expansion of alternative power centres. The growing importance of the prikaz system, staffed by professional administrators rather than hereditary nobles, gradually shifted the balance of power away from traditional aristocratic families. Military reforms reflected the regime's recognition that Russia's survival depended on developing more effective armed forces. The traditional militia system had proven inadequate against professional European armies, leading to experiments with foreign military advisors and new organisational structures. Regiments of foreign formation, trained and equipped according to European standards, were established alongside traditional Russian units. These reforms required significant financial resources and represented a major departure from traditional military practices. The question of serfdom became increasingly central to the Romanov consolidation of power. The government faced competing pressures from different social groups. Nobles demanded greater control over their peasants to ensure labour stability, while the state needed reliable tax revenue and military recruitment. The gradual tightening of restrictions on peasant movement reflected these practical concerns rather than ideological commitment to bondage. The Code of 1649, promulgated under Michael's successor Alexis, would formalise these restrictions into a comprehensive system of serfdom that would endure for centuries. Territorial expansion during the early Romanov period focused primarily on Siberia and the Far East, regions that offered valuable resources while avoiding direct confrontation with major European powers. The conquest of Siberia had begun under even the terrible with Ermak's expedition, but systematic colonization and administration developed under the Romanovs. Cossack expeditions pushed ever eastward, establishing fortified towns and trading posts that served as centers of Russian authority in the vast wilderness. The expansion into Siberia involved complex interactions with indigenous peoples who possessed their own sophisticated political and social structures. The Yakuts, for example, had developed a hierarchical society with established trade networks and military capabilities. Russian expansion often proceeded through a combination of military conquest, diplomatic negotiation, and economic integration. Indigenous leaders who submitted to Russian authority were often incorporated into the colonial administration, maintaining local power while acknowledging Moscow's sovereignty. The fur trade drove much of the Siberian expansion, with sable pelts commanding enormous prices in European markets. Russian merchants and administrators established a tribute system that required indigenous communities to provide furs in exchange for protection and trade goods. This system, known as yasak, created a complex web of relationships that bound native peoples to the Russian state, while providing the resources necessary to fund further expansion. The establishment of trading posts and fortified settlements across Siberia required careful planning and substantial resources. Each outpost needed to be defensible against potential attacks, while serving as a centre for trade and administration. The harsh climate and vast distances made supply lines extremely difficult to maintain, forcing local commanders to develop innovative solutions for survival and growth. Many settlements began as temporary winter quarters for Cossack expeditions, but gradually evolved into permanent towns with their own agricultural hinterlands. The push toward the Pacific Ocean culminated in the establishment of Okhotsk in 1647, giving Russia access to the sea and opening possibilities for further expansion into the Americas. This achievement represented one of the most remarkable territorial expansions in world history, extending Russian authority across an entire continent within a few decades. The speed of this expansion reflected the effectiveness of Cossack military organization and the relative weakness of indigenous resistance, but it also created administrative challenges that would persist for generations. The schism in the Russian Orthodox Church emerged as one of the most significant and enduring legacies of the early Romanov period. The controversy began with Patriarch Nikon's reforms implemented during the 1650s under Tsar Alexis. Nikon, a man of imposing physical presence and uncompromising personality, sought to correct what he perceived as errors in Russian liturgical practices by aligning them more closely with contemporary Greek Orthodox traditions. The reforms themselves might seem minor to modern observers: changes in the number of fingers used in making the sign of the cross, alterations to the spelling of Jesus' name, and modifications to various liturgical texts. However, these changes struck at the heart of Russian religious identity and sparked a crisis that would divide Russian society for centuries. Many Russians viewed their religious practices as sacred traditions handed down from the apostles themselves, making any alteration tantamount to heresy. Nikon's personality and methods exacerbated the controversy. He approached the reforms with characteristic authoritarianism, brooking no opposition and treating critics as enemies of the faith. His close relationship with Tsar Alexis initially provided political backing for the reforms, but his increasingly grandiose claims about patriarchal authority eventually alienated even his royal patron. Nikon's assertion that spiritual authority superseded temporal power directly challenged the traditional relationship between church and state in Russia. The opposition to Nikon's reforms coalesced around figures like Archpriest Avakum, whose passionate defense of traditional practices resonated with many Russians. Avakum's autobiography, written during his imprisonment, provides vivid insight into the religious fervour that drove the opposition movement. His descriptions of torture and persecution at the hands of church and state authorities became rallying cries for those who rejected the reforms. The schism created a permanent division within Russian Orthodoxy between those who accepted the reforms and those who maintained traditional practices. The Old Believers, as the traditionalists became known, faced severe persecution from both church and state authorities. Many fled to remote regions of the empire, establishing communities that preserved pre-reform traditions while developing their own forms of organization and leadership. The government's response to the schism revealed the limits of autocratic power when confronted with deeply held religious convictions. Despite extensive persecution, including executions, imprisonment, and forced relocations, the Old Believer movement continued to grow and adapt. Some communities chose martyrdom through self-immolation rather than accept the reforms, while others developed elaborate systems of concealment and resistance. The economic impact of the schism extended far beyond religious matters. Many Old Believers were merchants, craftsmen, and entrepreneurs whose skills and resources were lost to the mainstream economy. Their communities often developed alternative economic networks that operated parallel to official structures, creating a shadow economy that persisted well into the modern period. The international dimensions of the schism also proved significant. The reforms were intended partly to improve relations with other Orthodox churches, particularly the Greek patriarchates. However, the violent implementation of the reforms and the persecution of traditionalists damaged Russia's reputation among Orthodox believers elsewhere. The schism also provided opportunities for foreign powers to exploit Russian internal divisions, with some European governments offering refuge to persecuted Old Believers. The consolidation of Romanov power during this period established patterns that would characterize Russian governance for centuries. The gradual strengthening of autocratic authority, the expansion of territorial control, and the integration of church and state created a distinctive form of imperial rule that combined traditional Russian elements with innovations borrowed from European models. The success of this consolidation process laid the foundation for Russia's emergence as a major European power under Peter the Great and his successors. The death of Tsar Alexis in 1676 had set in motion a succession crisis that would ultimately bring to power one of history's most transformative rulers. When the sickly Tsar Fyodor III died childless in 1682, the throne passed jointly to his half-brothers Ivan V and the 10-year-old Peter I, with their sister Sophia serving as regent. This arrangement satisfied the competing claims of the Miloslavsky and Narishkin families, but it also created an inherently unstable power structure that would shape Peter's early experiences and worldview. The Streltsy uprising of 1682 provided young Peter with his first brutal lesson in the realities of political power. The elite Moscow Guard regiments, armed with muskets and pikes, had grown increasingly restive under the previous regime's attempts at military reform. When rumours spread that the Naryshkins had poisoned Tsar Fyodor, the Streltsy marched on the Kremlin with blood in their eyes. Peter witnessed the horrific spectacle as the guards hurled his maternal relatives from the palace balconies onto the upraised pikes below, their screams echoing through the courtyard. The sight of his uncle Afanasy Naryshkin's broken body impaled on the iron spear points would haunt Peter for the rest of his life, instilling in him a deep mistrust of traditional Russian military institutions and an obsession with creating new forms of armed force, answerable only to the crown. Sophia's regency from 1682 to 1689 provided Peter with an unexpected education in European military practices. Relegated to the suburban estate of Preobrazhenskoye, the young Kossar surrounded himself with foreign tutors and military advisors who introduced him to the latest developments in artillery, fortification and drill. Franz Lefort, a Swiss adventurer with extensive military experience, became Peter's closest confidant and mentor. Under Lefort's guidance, Peter organised his childhood companions into mock military units that gradually evolved into serious fighting forces. These play regiments, initially dismissed by the Moscow establishment as childish games, would eventually become the Preobrazhensky and Semenovsky Guards, the elite units that would serve as the backbone of Peter's military reforms. The young Tsar's fascination with European technology extended beyond military matters to encompass navigation, shipbuilding and engineering. He spent countless hours at the foreign quarter in Moscow, known as the German Quarter, where European merchants, craftsmen and soldiers had established a community that maintained many Western customs and practices. Here Peter encountered Protestant religious services, European architectural styles, and social customs that differed dramatically from traditional Russian court life. The experience opened his eyes to alternative ways of organising society and governance that would profoundly influence his later reforms. Peter's seizure of power in 1689 marked the beginning of his active reign, though his initial focus remained on consolidating control rather than implementing sweeping changes. The conspiracy against Sophia required careful coordination with loyal military units and sympathetic boyars, demonstrating Peter's growing political sophistication. The regent's supporters, including the ambitious Prince Vasily Golitsyn, were systematically removed from positions of influence, while Peter's own associates from the German Quarter and the play regiments assumed increasingly important roles in government. The Azov campaigns of 1695 and 1696 provided Peter with his first taste of serious military command and revealed both the potential and limitations of Russian military power. The initial assault on the Ottoman fortress of Azov failed spectacularly, with Russian forces proving unable to coordinate their attacks or maintain effective siege operations. The fortress's thick walls, reinforced with European-style bastions, withstood repeated bombardments from Russian artillery that lacked both the range and accuracy of contemporary European guns. More significantly, the Russian army's inability to prevent Ottoman naval forces from resupplying the garrison highlighted the critical importance of sea power in modern warfare. The Second Azov campaign demonstrated Peter's capacity for learning from failure and adapting his methods accordingly. Working with foreign engineers and naval advisors, he supervised the construction of a flotilla of galleys and fireships on the Don River. These vessels, built according to European designs but adapted for the shallow waters of the Sea of Azov, successfully blockaded the fortress and forced its surrender. The victory provided Peter with his first major military triumph and convinced him that Russia's future lay in mastering European military and naval techniques. The Great Embassy of 1697 to 1698 represented an unprecedented departure from traditional Russian diplomatic practice. Never before had a reigning Tsar travelled abroad, and Peter's decision to journey incognito through Europe as part of a large diplomatic mission shocked both Russian and European observers. The embassy's ostensible purpose involved building an anti-Ottoman coalition, but Peter's real agenda focused on studying European technology, military organisation, and governmental practices firsthand. In Amsterdam, Peter worked as a common shipwright in the yards of the Dutch East India Company, learning the practical skills of naval construction while observing the commercial and financial systems that supported Dutch maritime power. His massive frame, standing nearly 7 feet tall, made maintaining his disguise challenging, but his genuine enthusiasm for manual labour and technical learning impressed the Dutch craftsmen who worked alongside him. The experience provided Peter with detailed knowledge of ship design, timber selection, and rigging techniques that would prove invaluable in his later efforts to create a Russian navy. The visit to England proved equally transformative, as Peter observed the Royal Navy's operations at Portsmouth and Deptford. The sight of English ships of the line, with their precise formations and devastating firepower, convinced him that naval supremacy was essential for any nation aspiring to great power status. He recruited hundreds of British naval officers, shipwrights and gunners to serve in Russia, offering generous salaries and the promise of rapid advancement in a new navy that would be built from scratch according to the latest European standards. The Streltsy Rebellion of 1698 interrupted Peter's European tour and provided him with the opportunity to demonstrate his commitment to radical change. The traditional Moscow Guard regiments, already suspicious of the Tsar's foreign travels and European advisors, had risen in revolt while Peter was abroad. Their demands included the restoration of traditional Russian customs, the dismissal of foreign advisors, and Peter's return to Moscow to rule according to ancient precedents. The rebellion's suppression involved mass executions, conducted with a brutality that shocked even contemporary observers accustomed to harsh justice. Peter personally participated in the executions, wielding an axe to behead several Streltsy leaders, while forcing boyars and foreign diplomats to witness the proceedings. The systematic destruction of the Streltsy represented more than the suppression of a military revolt. It marked Peter's definitive break with traditional Russian military and political structures. The mass executions, conducted in Red Square and other public spaces throughout Moscow, served as a graphic demonstration of the consequences of resistance to royal authority. The bodies of executed Streltsy were left hanging from gallows for months, their decomposing corpses serving as constant reminders of the new order's ruthless determination to eliminate opposition. The Great Northern War began in 1700 with Russia's entry into an alliance with Denmark and Saxony-Poland against Sweden, then under the young king Charles II. Peter's decision to challenge Swedish dominance in the Baltic reflected his understanding that access to warm water ports was essential for Russia's development as a European power. The existing Russian coastline provided only limited access to international trade routes, with Arkhangelsk on the White Sea frozen for much of the year and the Black Sea controlled by the Ottoman Empire. The Battle of Narva in November 1700 provided Peter with a devastating lesson in the realities of modern warfare. Charles XII's veteran Swedish army, despite being significantly outnumbered, routed the Russian forces in a snowstorm that turned the battlefield into chaos. The Swedish king's tactical brilliance and his soldiers' superior training and equipment proved decisive against Russian troops who still relied largely on traditional fighting methods. The defeat was so complete that Charles XIV captured most of the Russian artillery and baggage train, leaving Peter's army in tatters and his reputation as a military commander in ruins. Rather than seeking peace after this humiliating defeat, Peter used the disaster at Narva as motivation for comprehensive military reform. He recognized that Russia could not compete with European powers using traditional military methods and began implementing changes that would transform the Russian army into a modern fighting force. The creation of new regiments trained according to European standards, the establishment of military academies, and the systematic recruitment of foreign officers represented a complete departure from previous Russian military practices. The development of Russian metallurgy and armaments production became a crucial component of Peter's military reforms. The Tsar personally supervised the construction of new foundries and weapons factories, often working alongside foreign technicians to understand the production processes. The Tula Arms Factory, expanded and modernized under Peter's direction, began producing muskets and artillery pieces that matched European standards of quality and reliability. These industrial developments not only supported military needs, but also laid the foundation for Russia's later economic development. Peter's military reforms extended to every aspect of army organization and training. The traditional system of noble service, based on hereditary obligations and feudal relationships, was replaced by a merit-based hierarchy that promoted officers based on competence rather than birth. The table of ranks, implemented in 1722, created a systematic structure for military and civilian advancement that would remain in place until the Russian Revolution. This system allowed talented individuals from humble backgrounds to rise to positions of authority while ensuring that traditional nobles maintained their privileges only through demonstrated service to the state. The creation of a professional officer corps required extensive educational reforms that challenged traditional Russian attitudes toward learning and foreign influence. Military academies were established in Moscow and St. Petersburg, staffed by foreign instructors who taught mathematics, engineering, languages, and military science. These institutions produced a new generation of Russian officers who combined technical competence with loyalty to the crown, gradually replacing the foreign mercenaries who had dominated the army's leadership during the early years of Peter's reign. The transformation of Russian military culture involved changes that extended far beyond technical training and organizational structure. Peter insisted that his officers adopt European dress, manners, and social customs, viewing these changes as essential components of military modernization. The traditional Russian beard, long considered a mark of Orthodox piety and masculine dignity, was banned among military personnel and court officials. Those who wished to maintain their beards were required to pay substantial taxes, with the revenue supporting military expenses and symbolically demonstrating the cost of clinging to traditional practices. The founding of St. Petersburg in 1703 represented perhaps the most audacious of Peter's transformative projects. The decision to build a new capital city on the marshy islands of the Neva Delta, in territory recently captured from Sweden, reflected both strategic considerations and symbolic intentions. The location provided direct access to the Baltic Sea and European trade routes, while the city's European architectural style and urban planning served as a physical manifestation of Russia's transformation into a modern European power. The construction of St. Petersburg required enormous human and material resources that strained the Russian economy and social system. Tens of thousands of workers, including serfs, soldiers, and foreign craftsmen, laboured in the harsh conditions of the northern climate to build the city according to Peter's exacting specifications. The mortality rate among construction workers was staggering, with estimates suggesting that over 100,000 people died during the city's first decades of construction. These deaths resulted from disease, accidents, and the brutal working conditions that characterized most of Peter's major projects. The architectural vision for St. Petersburg drew inspiration from Amsterdam, Venice, and other European cities that Peter had visited during his travels. The city's grid pattern of streets, its network of canals, and its Baroque palaces and churches represented a complete departure from traditional Russian urban design. Foreign architects, including Domenico Trassini and Bartolomeo Rastrelli, were recruited to design major buildings and establish architectural standards that would influence Russian construction for generations. The forced relocation of the capital from Moscow to St. Petersburg in 1712 symbolized Peter's determination to break with traditional Russian political and social structures. The ancient capital, with its Kremlin walls and Orthodox churches, represented centuries of Russian history and tradition. By moving the seat of government to a new city built according to European models, Peter demonstrated his commitment to transforming Russia into a modern European state regardless of the cost in human suffering or cultural continuity. The resistance to the capital's relocation came from multiple sources, including the Orthodox Church, traditional nobles, and ordinary citizens who viewed the move as an abandonment of Russian identity. The Patriarch of Moscow refused to relocate his residence to St. Petersburg, creating a symbolic division between the old religious capital and the new secular one. Many noble families attempted to avoid the mandatory relocation by claiming illness or family obligations, leading to increasingly harsh penalties for those who failed to comply with the Tsar's orders. The cultural transformation imposed by Peter's reforms touched every aspect of Russian society, from clothing and social customs to education and religious practice. The introduction of the Julian calendar in 1700 replaced the traditional Byzantine calendar that had dated years from the creation of the world, symbolically aligning Russia with European chronological systems. This change required the reprinting of religious texts and the retraining of clergy, representing a significant disruption to traditional religious practices. The subordination of the Orthodox Church to state control represented one of Peter's most controversial and lasting reforms. The abolition of the Patriarchate in 1721 and its replacement with the Holy Synod, a government-controlled board of bishops, effectively transformed the church into a department of the state bureaucracy. This change eliminated the possibility of church-state conflicts that had plagued previous reigns while ensuring that religious authority supported, rather than challenged, royal policies. The implementation of Western dress codes and social customs created visible symbols of the new order that penetrated daily life throughout Russian society. The traditional Russian kaftan was banned at court and in government offices, replaced by European-style coats, breeches and stockings. Women's clothing underwent similar transformation, with traditional Russian dresses giving way to European gowns that emphasized different aesthetic values and social relationships. These changes were enforced through fines, social pressure, and direct royal intervention, creating a society where external appearance reflected political loyalty and cultural orientation. Peter the Great's death in January 1725 plunged Russia into a succession crisis that would fundamentally alter the nature of imperial rule. The emperor had failed to designate a clear heir, leaving behind a complex web of potential claimants that included his second wife, Catherine I, his grandson, Peter II, and his daughter, Elizabeth. The Guards regiments, now the arbiters of political power in the transformed Russian state, found themselves in the unprecedented position of choosing the next ruler. This moment marked the beginning of what historians term the era of palace revolutions, a period when the throne changed hands through military coups rather than hereditary succession. Catherine I's elevation to the throne represented a remarkable transformation in Russian political culture. Born Martha Skavronskaya, a Lithuanian peasant who had been captured during the Great Northern War, she had risen from servitude to become Peter's mistress, and eventually his wife. Her coronation as empress in her own right, rather than merely as a regent for a male heir, established a precedent that would prove crucial for later female rulers. The ceremony itself reflected the new imperial grandeur that Peter had introduced, with European-style court dress, elaborate decorations, and foreign diplomatic representatives witnessing the unprecedented spectacle of a former serf being crowned as autocrat of all the Russias. The Menshikov faction, led by Peter's former favourite Alexander Menshikov, orchestrated Catherine's accession through careful manipulation of the Guards regiments and the newly created Senate. Menshikov understood that Catherine's humble origins and limited education made her dependent on advisors, providing him with the opportunity to exercise real power while maintaining the fiction of imperial authority. The arrangement satisfied the Guards' desire for stability while ensuring that Peter's reforms would continue under the guidance of those who had implemented them. Catherine's brief reign from 1725 to 1727 established important precedents for female rule while revealing the limitations of puppet monarchy. Her court maintained the European customs and ceremonies that Peter had introduced, with elaborate balls, theatrical performances, and diplomatic receptions that demonstrated Russia's commitment to its new cultural orientation. However, the Empress's inability to read or write effectively limited her participation in actual governance, creating a power vacuum that various court factions attempted to fill through intrigue and manipulation. The succession of Peter II in 1727, following Catherine I's death, initially appeared to restore traditional male rule, but the young emperor's minority ensured continued political instability. The Dolgoruki family, representing the old boyar aristocracy that had been marginalized under Peter the Great, seized the opportunity to regain influence by isolating the boy emperor from his Petrine advisors. Prince Dmitry Dolgoruki became the dominant figure at court, arranging the exile of Menshikov and attempting to reverse many of Peter's reforms through a policy of deliberate traditionalism. The Dolgoruki ascendancy represented a systematic attempt to restore pre-Petrine political and social structures. The court was moved back to Moscow, symbolically rejecting St. Petersburg and its European associations. Traditional Russian dress was encouraged, foreign advisors were dismissed, and the Orthodox Church was given greater autonomy in its internal affairs. These changes reflected a broader reaction against the rapid westernization of the previous reign, with many Russians viewing the return to traditional practices as a restoration of authentic national identity. Peter II's sudden death from smallpox in 1730, on the very day scheduled for his wedding to Catherine Dolgorukaya, created another succession crisis that would prove even more significant than the previous ones. The Dolgoruki family's desperate attempt to forge a will naming Catherine Dolgoruskaya as empress failed when the document's authenticity was challenged by rival court factions. The extinction of the male line of the Romanov dynasty forced the political elite to consider female candidates from collateral branches, ultimately leading to the selection of Anna Ivanovna, daughter of Peter the Great's half-brother, Ivan V. The Supreme Privy Council's attempt to limit Anna's power through constitutional restrictions marked a unique moment in Russian political history. The conditions imposed on the new empress included prohibitions on declaring war, raising taxes, or making major appointments without the council's consent. These limitations, inspired by contemporary European constitutional monarchies, represented an attempt to create a more balanced system of government that would prevent the arbitrary exercise of autocratic power while maintaining the monarchy's legitimacy and continuity. Anna Ivanovna's rejection of the constitutional limitations upon her arrival in Moscow demonstrated the fundamental incompatibility between limited monarchy and Russian political culture. The empress had spent 18 years in Courland, where she had observed European court practices and governmental systems, but she understood that accepting restrictions on her authority would fatally undermine the autocratic principle that had enabled Peter's reforms. Her dramatic tearing up of the constitutional document before an assembled crowd of nobles and guards officers symbolized the restoration of unlimited imperial power and the failure of Russia's brief experiment with constitutional monarchy. The reign of Anna Ivanovna from 1730 to 1740 established a new model of female rule that combined traditional autocratic authority with continued commitment to European cultural and military practices. The empress surrounded herself with foreign advisors, particularly Germans from her former Duchy of Courland, who implemented policies that maintained Peter's reforms while adapting them to new circumstances. Ernst Johann von Biron, Anna's favourite and rumoured lover, became the dominant figure in Russian politics, using his influence to advance fellow Germans to positions of authority throughout the government and military. The so-called German domination during Anna's reign reflected practical considerations rather than ethnic prejudice or foreign control. The empress needed advisors who possessed European education and administrative experience but who remained dependent on her favour for their positions. German nobles from the Baltic provinces and the Holy Roman Empire provided this combination of competence and loyalty, having been educated in European universities and governmental practices while lacking independent power bases within Russian society. Anna's court became renowned throughout Europe for its extravagance and bizarre entertainments that reflected both imperial grandeur and the empress's peculiar sense of humour. The famous ice palace constructed for the wedding of her court jester Prince Golitsyn demonstrated the enormous resources at the disposal of the Russian crown while providing a spectacle that amazed foreign observers. The palace, built entirely of ice blocks and furnished with ice furniture, cannons and decorations, required the labour of thousands of workers and represented a triumph of engineering and artistic achievement that showcased Russian capabilities in unexpected ways. The military campaigns during Anna's reign consolidated Russian territorial gains while establishing the empire's reputation as a major European power. The War of Polish Succession from 1733 to 1735 demonstrated Russia's ability to project power beyond its borders in support of political objectives. Russian forces successfully installed Augustus III on the Polish throne, defeating French-backed opposition and establishing Russian influence over Polish internal affairs. The campaign required complex logistical planning and diplomatic coordination that proved Russian military and administrative capabilities had advanced significantly since Peter's early struggles. The Russo-Turkish War of 1735 to 1739 provided Russian forces with the opportunity to test their capabilities against the Ottoman Empire in a major conflict that would determine control over the Black Sea region. Field Marshal Burkhard Christoph von Munich's campaigns demonstrated the effectiveness of European military methods adapted to Russian conditions. The Siege of Ochakov in 1737 showcased Russian engineering capabilities with elaborate trench systems and artillery positions that overcame the fortress's formidable defences through systematic application of European siege techniques. The capture of Ochakov required a prolonged siege that tested Russian logistical capabilities and military discipline. The fortress, strategically located at the mouth of the Dnieper River, controlled access to the Black Sea and had been strengthened with modern bastions and artillery positions. Russian forces constructed extensive siege works under constant enemy fire, demonstrating the professional competence that had been developed through decades of military reform and foreign instruction. Anna's death in 1740 precipitated another succession crisis that would ultimately bring Elizabeth Petrovna to power through the most dramatic palace coup in Russian history. The Empress had designated her infant grandnephew Ivan VI as her successor, with Ernst Johann von Biron serving as regent. This arrangement satisfied no major constituency within Russian society. The Guards regiments distrusted Biron's foreign origins, the nobility resented German domination of key positions, and the Orthodox Church opposed the influence of Protestant advisors over the young emperor's upbringing. Elizabeth's coup in November 1741 represented a masterpiece of political planning and military execution that established her as one of the most capable rulers in Russian history. The princess had spent years cultivating relationships with Guards officers, court officials, and foreign diplomats, building a network of supporters who shared her commitment to restoring what they viewed as authentic Russian governance. Her personal charisma, combined with her status as Peter the Great's daughter, provided the legitimacy necessary to challenge the established order. The actual coup unfolded with remarkable precision and minimal violence. Elizabeth personally led a company of Preobrazhensky Guards to the Winter Palace, where they arrested the infant emperor, his parents, and the leading members of the German faction. The operation's success depended on careful timing and the loyalty of key military units, demonstrating Elizabeth's understanding of the political dynamics that had developed since her father's death. The bloodless nature of the coup enhanced Elizabeth's reputation and provided a model for future palace revolutions. Elizabeth's reign from 1741 to 1762 represented a synthesis of Petrine reforms with traditional Russian cultural values that created a distinctive form of enlightened absolutism. The Empress combined genuine intellectual curiosity with practical political skills, surrounding herself with both Russian and foreign advisors who shared her commitment to advancing Russian interests through European methods. Her court became a centre of learning and artistic achievement that rivaled Versailles in its sophistication, while maintaining distinctly Russian characteristics. The 7 Years' War provided Elizabeth with the opportunity to demonstrate Russia's emergence as a major European power capable of influencing the balance of power across the continent. The conflict, which pitted Russia, Austria and France against Prussia and Britain, required unprecedented military and diplomatic coordination. Russian forces proved their effectiveness against Frederick the Great's Prussian army, widely considered the finest military force in Europe, through victories at Gross-Jägersdorf and Kunersdorf that shocked contemporary observers. The Battle of Kunersdorf in August 1759 marked the pinnacle of Russian military achievement during Elizabeth's reign. Russian and Austrian forces, numbering approximately 90,000 troops, faced Frederick the Great's army of 50,000 Prussians in a confrontation that would determine the war's outcome in Eastern Europe. The battle began at dawn with a Prussian assault on Russian positions that initially achieved significant success, breaking through the first line of defences and capturing several artillery batteries. The Russian response demonstrated the effectiveness of the military reforms that had been implemented since Peter the Great's death. General Pyotr Saltykov's careful positioning of reserves and his coordination with Austrian allies created a defensive system that absorbed the Prussian assault while maintaining the capability for counterattack. The Russian infantry, armed with modern muskets and trained in European tactics, delivered disciplined volleys that shattered Prussian formations, while Russian artillery, served by skilled gunners, provided devastating support fire that turned the tide of battle. Frederick the Great's personal leadership during the battle highlighted the desperate nature of the Prussian position. The king, mounted on his favourite horse and wearing his distinctive blue uniform, led repeated cavalry charges against Russian positions, seeking to break through the enemy lines through sheer audacity and personal example. His presence inspired extraordinary efforts from his troops, but Russian defensive preparations and superior numbers ultimately proved decisive. The aftermath of Kunersdorf left Frederick's army in ruins, with over 20,000 casualties, including most of the Prussian officer corps. The king himself barely escaped capture, writing to his ministers that he considered the battle a complete disaster that might end his reign. Russian losses, while significant, were proportionally much lower. demonstrating the effectiveness of their defensive tactics and the superiority of their artillery preparation. Elizabeth's domestic policies reflected her commitment to cultural development and administrative reform that built upon Peter's foundation, while addressing the needs of a more sophisticated society. The establishment of Moscow University in 1755 represented a landmark achievement in Russian education, creating an institution that would train generations of Russian intellectuals, administrators, and professionals. The university's curriculum, based on European models but adapted to Russian conditions, included faculties of philosophy, medicine, and law that provided comprehensive higher education for the first time in Russian history. The Academy of Arts, founded in 1757, demonstrated Elizabeth's commitment to cultural development and artistic achievement. The institution, staffed by European masters and Russian artists, established standards of training and creativity that elevated Russian art to international levels. Students learned painting, sculpture, and architecture according to European techniques, while developing distinctly Russian themes and styles that reflected the empire's unique cultural heritage. Elizabeth's religious policies balanced respect for Orthodox tradition with the practical needs of a multi-ethnic empire. The Empress maintained close relationships with church leaders, while ensuring that religious authority remained subordinate to imperial power. Her personal piety, demonstrated through pilgrimages and charitable works, enhanced her legitimacy among ordinary Russians, while her tolerance of other faiths reflected the pragmatic requirements of governing a diverse population. The succession crisis that followed Elizabeth's death in 1762 brought Peter III to the throne under circumstances that highlighted the continuing instability of the Russian political system. The new emperor, Elizabeth's nephew and heir, had been raised in Holstein and retained strong sympathies for Prussia and Protestant culture that alienated both the Orthodox Church and the military establishment. His immediate reversal of Russian foreign policy, including withdrawal from the 7 Years' War and alliance with Frederick the Great, outraged officers who had sacrificed extensively to achieve victory over Prussia. Peter III's brief reign of 6 months demonstrated the limits of imperial authority when exercised without regard for established interests and cultural sensibilities. His attempts to reorganize the Orthodox Church according to Protestant models, his plans to withdraw Russia from European politics, and his obvious contempt for Russian customs and traditions created a coalition of opposition that included his own wife, Catherine. The emperor's German advisors and his open preference for Holstein interests over Russian concerns provided his enemies with powerful arguments against his continued rule. Catherine's coup in June 1762 represented the culmination of the palace revolution tradition that had dominated Russian politics since Peter the Great's death. The conspiracy, organized by Grigory Orlov and other Guards officers, demonstrated the sophisticated political networks that had developed within the imperial system. Catherine's personal involvement in the planning and execution of the coup, including her dramatic appearance before the Guards regiments in borrowed military uniform, showcased the political skills that would make her one of Russia's most successful rulers. The arrest and subsequent death of Peter III removed the last obstacle to Catherine's assumption of full imperial authority. The circumstances of the former emperor's death, officially attributed to natural causes but widely believed to result from violence, demonstrated the brutal realities of Russian court politics. Catherine's ability to distance herself from responsibility for her husband's death, while benefiting from his removal, revealed the political sophistication that would characterize her long reign. Catherine II's early years as empress focused on consolidating power while establishing her credentials as an enlightened ruler, committed to rational governance and social improvement. Her correspondence with Voltaire, Diderot, and other European intellectuals demonstrated her engagement with contemporary philosophical and political thought. The Empress's commitment to legal reform, administrative efficiency, and cultural development reflected genuine intellectual conviction as well as practical political calculation. The Nakaz, or Instruction, published by Catherine in 1767, represented one of the most ambitious attempts at legal codification in 18th century Europe. The document, drawing heavily on the works of Montesquieu and Beccaria, outlined principles of rational governance that emphasized the rule of law, proportionate punishment, and protection of individual rights. The Nakaz's 655 articles covered everything from criminal procedure to administrative organization, providing a comprehensive blueprint for governmental reform that influenced legal development throughout Europe. The Legislative Commission, convened in 1767 to implement the Nakaz's principles, brought together representatives from across the Russian Empire in an unprecedented experiment in participatory governance. The commission included delegates from the nobility, merchants, state peasants and Cossacks, creating a forum for discussion of legal and social issues that had never before been addressed in such a comprehensive manner. The proceedings, conducted in Russian rather than Latin or French, demonstrated Catherine's commitment to involving Russian society in the process of governmental reform. The Commission's debates revealed the complex social tensions that characterized Russian society in the mid-18th century. Noble representatives demanded confirmation of their privileges and expanded rights over serfs, while merchant delegates sought protection from arbitrary taxation and bureaucratic interference. Cossack representatives insisted on maintaining their traditional autonomy and military obligations, while state peasants requested relief from excessive taxation and military recruitment. These competing demands highlighted the challenges facing any attempt at comprehensive legal reform. Catherine's territorial expansion during the early years of her reign demonstrated Russia's emergence as a dominant power in Eastern Europe and the Black Sea region. The First Russo-Turkish War, from 1768 to 1774, provided the Empress with the opportunity to implement military and diplomatic strategies that would establish Russian control over vast territories while demonstrating the Empire's military capabilities to European observers. The conflict's origins lay in Ottoman support for Polish opposition to Russian influence, creating a pretext for Russian intervention that served broader strategic objectives. The Siege of Bendery in 1770 showcased the evolution of Russian military engineering and artillery techniques since the early 18th century. Russian forces, commanded by General Pyotr Rumyantsev, employed systematic siege methods that combined European techniques with innovations adapted to local conditions. The fortress, protected by modern bastions and defended by experienced Ottoman troops, required a prolonged siege that tested Russian logistical capabilities and military discipline. Russian siege operations at Bendery demonstrated the sophisticated coordination required for successful 18th century warfare. Engineers constructed elaborate trench systems that approached the fortress walls while providing protection for advancing troops. Artillery batteries, positioned according to careful mathematical calculations, delivered concentrated fire that gradually destroyed the fortress's defences. The siege's success required coordination between infantry, artillery and engineering units that reflected the professional competence developed through decades of military reform. The naval victory at Chesme in 1770 marked Russia's emergence as a significant naval power in the Mediterranean and demonstrated the Empire's ability to project force far from its traditional areas of operation. The Russian fleet, commanded by Admiral Grigory Spiridov and advised by British officers, achieved a decisive victory over the Ottoman navy that eliminated Turkish naval power in the Aegean Sea. The battle's outcome resulted from superior Russian gunnery, tactical coordination, and the effective use of fireships that destroyed much of the Ottoman fleet. The Treaty of Kukuk-Kainarkar in 1774 formalized Russian territorial gains while establishing the Empire's influence over Ottoman internal affairs. The agreement granted Russia control over the Crimean Peninsula, access to the Black Sea, and the right to protect Orthodox Christians within the Ottoman Empire. These concessions provided Russia with the strategic advantages necessary for further expansion, while creating pretexts for future intervention in Ottoman affairs. The Pugachev Rebellion from 1773 to 1775 revealed the deep social tensions that underlay Catherine's enlightened reforms and territorial expansion. Emelian Pugachev, a Don Cossack who claimed to be the murdered Peter III, attracted support from serfs, Cossacks and religious minorities who opposed the increasing centralization of the imperial authority. The rebellion's scale and duration demonstrated the fragility of Russian social order and the potential for popular uprising against autocratic rule. Pugachev's proclamations promised the abolition of serfdom, the elimination of noble privileges, and the restoration of traditional Cossack autonomy. These appeals resonated with diverse groups who had been marginalized by Catherine's reforms and territorial expansion. The rebellion's support base included Bashkirs, Tatars, and other ethnic minorities who resented Russian colonial policies, as well as old believers and other religious dissidents who opposed state control of religious practice. The suppression of the Pugachev rebellion required extensive military operations that diverted resources from the Turkish war and revealed the limitations of Russian administrative control over distant territories. General Alexander Suvorov's final defeat of Pugachev's forces demonstrated the effectiveness of professional military units against irregular troops, but the rebellion's duration and geographical extent highlighted the challenges of governing a vast empire with limited administrative resources. Catherine the Great's death on November 17, 1796, marked the end of an era that had seen Russia emerge as a dominant European power, but it also ushered in a period of profound uncertainty and dramatic reversals that would test the empire's stability and resilience. Her son, Paul I, who had waited 34 years to inherit the throne, ascended to power with a complex mixture of resentment toward his mother's policies and a burning desire to restore what he perceived as proper, autocratic authority. The new emperor's physical appearance reflected his troubled psychological state. His snub nose, protruding eyes, and nervous mannerisms created an impression of instability that would prove prophetic for his reign. Paul's first acts as emperor revealed his intention to systematically reverse his mother's policies and establish a new order based on rigid military discipline and Prussian-style administration. Within days of his accession, he recalled thousands of officers and officials whom Catherine had dismissed or exiled, while simultaneously dismissing many of her favourites and appointees. The emperor's obsession with military precision extended to the most minute details of court life, with elaborate regulations governing everything from the length of soldiers' hair to the exact angle at which hats must be worn. Foreign observers noted that the imperial court now resembled a military barracks more than a centre of European culture and diplomacy. The new emperor's admiration for Prussian military organisation led to comprehensive reforms that transformed the Russian army's appearance and procedures, while often undermining its effectiveness. Paul ordered the adoption of Prussian-style uniforms, complete with powdered hair, tight-fitting coats, and elaborate ceremonial accessories that proved impractical for actual military service. The emperor personally supervised drill exercises in the palace courtyard, correcting the smallest errors in formation or movement while subjecting officers to public humiliation for minor infractions. These changes created widespread resentment among military personnel who had served with distinction under Catherine's more flexible system. Paul's foreign policy represented an equally dramatic departure from his mother's approach, characterized by sudden shifts in alliances and strategic objectives that confused both Russian diplomats and European partners. Initially, the emperor withdrew Russia from the Second Coalition against France, expressing admiration for Napoleon's military genius and authoritarian methods. This decision shocked European courts that had relied on Russian military support against French expansion, while domestic critics viewed it as a betrayal of Russian interests and Orthodox principles. The emperor's domestic policies reflected his determination to restore traditional, autocratic authority, while eliminating what he perceived as dangerous liberal influences introduced during Catherine's reign. The Charter to the Nobility, which had guaranteed noble privileges and limited government interference in aristocratic affairs, was effectively suspended through a series of decrees that subjected nobles to corporal punishment, arbitrary arrest, and confiscation of property. These measures created unprecedented anxiety among the ruling class, who had grown accustomed to legal protections and predictable treatment under Catherine's administration. Paul's treatment of the Guards regiments, traditionally the arbiters of political power in Russia, demonstrated his fundamental misunderstanding of the forces that had shaped imperial politics since Peter the Great's death. The emperor subjected Guards officers to the same rigid discipline and humiliating punishments that he imposed on regular army units, failing to recognize that these men possessed both the capability and inclination to remove rulers who threatened their interests. His public reprimands of senior officers, including physical violence against those who failed to meet his exacting standards, created a climate of fear and resentment that would ultimately prove fatal. The emperor's personal eccentricities became increasingly pronounced as his reign progressed, manifesting in bizarre regulations and arbitrary decisions that affected every aspect of Russian society. Paul banned the waltz as morally corrupting, prohibited the wearing of round hats as symbols of revolutionary sentiment, and required citizens to kneel when his carriage passed, regardless of weather conditions or street surfaces. These measures, while seemingly trivial, created a pervasive atmosphere of uncertainty and fear that extended throughout Russian society. The construction of the Mikhailovsky castle represented Paul's paranoid obsession with security and his growing isolation from Russian society. The fortress-like structure, surrounded by moats and drawbridges, reflected the emperor's fear of assassination, while symbolizing his alienation from the people he ruled. The castle's design incorporated the latest military engineering techniques, with bastions, gun emplacements, and underground passages that could theoretically protect the emperor from any conceivable threat. The irony that Paul would ultimately be murdered within this supposedly impregnable fortress demonstrated the futility of his security measures. Paul's renewed alliance with Britain and Austria in 1798 marked another dramatic reversal in Russian foreign policy that reflected his impulsive decision-making and susceptibility to external influence. The emperor's decision to join the Second Coalition against France was motivated partly by his anger at Napoleon's occupation of Malta, whose Grand Master Paul had become, and partly by his desire to restore traditional European monarchical principles. This policy change required extensive military preparations and diplomatic negotiations that strained Russian resources while creating new international obligations. The Italian campaign of 1799 under Field Marshal Alexander Suvorov demonstrated Russian military capabilities while highlighting the challenges of coalition warfare. Suvorov's victories at Cassano, Trebia, and Novi showcased the effectiveness of Russian tactics and the competence of Russian officers, but the campaign's ultimate failure resulted from poor coordination with Austrian allies and conflicting strategic objectives. The legendary march across the Alps, while demonstrating Russian military endurance and Suvorov's tactical brilliance, achieved no significant strategic results and cost thousands of Russian lives. The conspiracy against Paul Thus developed gradually among guards officers, court officials, and foreign diplomats who recognized that the emperor's erratic behavior threatened Russian stability and international standing. Count Nikita Panin, a prominent court official, and General Levin Bennigsen, a Hanoverian officer in Russian service, emerged as the conspiracy's leaders, carefully recruiting supporters while maintaining absolute secrecy about their intentions. The plotters initially hoped to force Paul's abdication in favour of his son Alexander, but they recognized that the emperor's paranoid temperament made peaceful transition impossible. The assassination of Paul I on March 23, 1801, unfolded with dramatic intensity that reflected both the conspirators' desperation and the emperor's isolation from potential sources of support. The assassins, led by Bennigsen and including several guards officers, gained access to the Mikhailovsky castle through the complicity of palace guards who had been alienated by Paul's harsh treatment. The emperor, awakened in his bedroom by the intruders, initially attempted to negotiate before being strangled with a silk scarf when he refused to abdicate. The brutal nature of his death, involving multiple assailants and lasting several minutes, demonstrated the intensity of hatred that Paul's policies had generated among the military elite. Alexander VI's accession to the throne at age 23 brought to power a ruler whose complex personality and conflicting impulses would shape Russian history for the next quarter century. The new emperor's tall, elegant figure and refined manners created a striking contrast with his father's awkward appearance and erratic behaviour, while his European education and liberal sympathies suggested a return to Catherine's enlightened policies. However, Alexander's knowledge of the conspiracy against his father and his failure to prevent the assassination created a burden of guilt that would influence his decisions throughout his reign. The emperor's initial reforms reflected his commitment to liberal principles and his desire to modernize Russian institutions according to European models. The restoration of the charter to the nobility eliminated the arbitrary punishments and legal uncertainties that had characterized Paul's reign, while new educational policies expanded access to learning and encouraged intellectual development. The establishment of universities in St. Petersburg, Kazan, and Kharkiv demonstrated Alexander's commitment to creating an educated administrative class capable of implementing comprehensive reforms. Alexander's relationship with Mikhail Speransky, a priest's son who rose to become the empire's leading reformer, illustrated both the emperor's liberal aspirations and the practical limitations of autocratic reform. Speransky's comprehensive plan for governmental reorganization, including the creation of elected assemblies and an independent judiciary, represented the most ambitious attempt at constitutional reform in Russian history. The system's theoretical elegance and European inspiration appealed to Alexander's intellectual interests, but its implementation required fundamental changes in Russian political culture that proved impossible to achieve. The Napoleonic Wars transformed Alexander from a domestic reformer into a European statesman whose decisions would determine the fate of the continent. Napoleon's rise to power and his systematic conquest of European territories created an existential threat to the traditional monarchical order that Russia represented. The emperor's initial attempts to maintain neutrality while pursuing domestic reforms proved impossible, as French expansion threatened Russian interests in Poland, the Baltic, and the Mediterranean. The Third Coalition of 1805 brought Russia into direct military confrontation with Napoleon for the first time, testing both Russian military capabilities and Alexander's leadership under extreme pressure. The emperor's decision to personally command Russian forces reflected his sense of dynastic honor and his belief that royal presence would inspire greater efforts from his troops. However, his lack of military experience and his tendency to defer to Austrian strategic advice created conditions that would lead to disaster at Austerlitz. The Battle of Austerlitz on December 2, 1805, marked one of the most decisive defeats in Russian military history and demonstrated Napoleon's tactical genius at its peak. The engagement began before dawn with Russian and Austrian forces, numbering approximately 85,000 troops, attempting to outflank Napoleon's supposedly smaller army of 73,000 French soldiers. Alexander's presence on the battlefield, mounted on his white horse and wearing the distinctive green uniform of the Semenovsky Guards, provided inspiration for Russian troops, but also created additional pressure for immediate victory. The initial Russian assault on the village of Sokolnitz achieved temporary success, with Russian infantry breaking through French defensive positions and capturing several artillery batteries. The morning fog that shrouded the battlefield created confusion among both armies, with units firing on their own forces and commanders losing contact with their subordinates. Russian cavalry charges, led by the Imperial Guard, demonstrated the traditional courage and discipline of Russian mounted units, but they were ultimately repelled by French artillery and infantry formations that maintained their cohesion despite heavy casualties. Napoleon's counterattack, launched from the Pratzen Heights after the fog lifted, caught the Allied forces in an exposed position that made effective resistance impossible. French artillery, positioned on the commanding heights, delivered devastating fire into the massed Russian and Austrian columns below, while French infantry advanced with bayonets fixed to complete the destruction of enemy formations. The sight of Russian Guards regiments, the Empire's most elite units, breaking under French assault